Silas Bell said it without raising his voice, and that made it worse. "Stay away from my daughter." Caleb Mercer pulled his gloves off one finger at a time and looked the older man straight in the eye. "If Miss Bell asks me a question about ranch work, I'll answer it." Silas stepped closer. "I'm not talking about ranch work." A long silence filled the barn. Then Silas said the four words that changed everything. "I know about Red Fork." And something moved across Caleb's face. Not guilt, not defiance. Something that looked almost like relief. If this story already has you gripped, subscribe right now so you never miss what comes next, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Caleb Mercer had not intended to stay in Bexar County longer than a week. He rode on to Bellweather Ranch on a Tuesday morning in late September, carrying nothing but a bedroll, a canvas saddlebag, and a reputation that followed him like a shadow he'd stopped trying to outrun. The foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Holt, looked him over, the way a man examines a horse he's already half decided not to buy. References. None worth writing down. Holt's jaw tightened. "That's not exactly a selling point, friend." "No," Caleb agreed. "But your water trough is." Holt turned. Caleb was already moving toward the east pasture fence where 3 cattle stood apart from the rest of the herd heads, low legs uncertain. He crouched beside the trough, studied the line of green along the wood, leaned over and smelled it, then straightened up. Something died upstream in the last few days. Organic matter's been collecting under that back ledge, he pointed without drama. Those 3 animals aren't sick. They drank from the wrong end of a fouled trough. Pull them out clean, the tank, give them fresh water and rest. You'll have them back with the herd by Thursday. Holt stared at him. "And if I'm wrong," Caleb added, "I'll leave without asking for a dime." Silas Bell was standing at the edge of the yard when it happened. He had come out to check on the weak cattle himself, already calculating what it would cost to put 3 animals down and whether a diseased herd could spread before he'd isolated them. He heard the stranger's diagnosis. He watched Holt kneel beside the trough and find exactly what the man described. He hired Caleb Mercer before noon. Rebecca Bell heard about the new trail hand from Martha, her father's younger sister, who had a habit of delivering information alongside whatever else she happened to be carrying. In this case, it was a basket of mended linen and the observation that the new man had saved 3 head of cattle without asking for praise or pay. "He didn't ask your father anything," Martha said. "Just walked over and showed him." Rebecca was copying feed costs into the ranch ledger. She didn't look up. "Good workers usually do." "He's quiet," Martha continued, as though Rebecca had expressed particular interest. "Reads from what Holt says, keeps to himself." "A great many men keep to themselves. Not many of them smell a fouled trough from 30 yards and know what it means." Rebecca set her pen down. "What's his name?" "Caleb Mercer." She picked up her pen again. She met him 4 days later, and not by arrangement. She had gone out to check on the recovered cattle herself, partly because her father had asked her to note their condition in the ledger, and partly because she preferred checking things with her own eyes over reading someone else's account of them. The 3 animals were back with the herd. That much was easy to confirm. What she hadn't expected was to find Caleb Mercer crouched beside the fence on the far side of the pasture, his hat pushed back, studying something on the ground with the focused quiet of a man trying to solve a problem before it became one. She stopped. He didn't hear her. He was reading the ground the way cattle had moved through a section of dried grass, the pressure points in the dust, the angle of a fence post that leaned 2 degrees more than it should. His lips moved slightly, as though he were working through numbers. Then he stood, pulled out a small worn notebook, and wrote something down. Rebecca walked forward. "What are you writing?" He turned without startlement. Most men startled. He simply turned the way a man turns when he already knew someone was coming and was only waiting to see who. "Water drainage notes." He closed the notebook. "If the creek behind the south pasture keeps dropping the way it has this week, you'll have a grazing conflict by November. The cattle will push toward the limestone ridge, and the grass up there doesn't hold the same nutrition." She looked at him for a moment. "My father's foreman handles grazing rotations." I know. He tucked the notebook into his vest pocket. I'm writing it down so I don't forget it. What Holt does with it is his business. She watched him pick up his gloves. Do you always take notes on other people's property? Only when I think something's going to go wrong, and I'd rather have it written than regret it wasn't. He walked back toward the barn, and Rebecca stood in the pasture for a moment longer, watching the cattle drift through the grass he'd been studying. Then she went back to the house and entered his drainage observation in the margin of the ledger in her own handwriting next to the November feed projections. Nathaniel Price arrived at Bellweather 3 days after that. He came from San Antonio in a well-kept buggy with clean boots and a pressed coat, and Silas Bell met him on the porch with the particular warmth he reserved for men who arrived looking like exactly what they were. Nathaniel was 36, a cattle commission agent, and he had been doing business with Silas for 4 years. He was honest. He was solvent. He was the kind of man who asked before he assumed and thanked before he left. How was also Rebecca knew, without requiring anyone to say it aloud, precisely the kind of man her father hoped she might one day consider marrying. Dinner that evening was linen napkins and the good china from the cabinet her mother had filled before she died. Martha had made a roast and 2 kinds of pie. Nathaniel talked cattle prices with the easy confidence of a man who knew them cold, and knew that knowing them impressed the men he needed to impress. Silas leaned forward, engaged the tension he usually carried across his shoulders, softened by business discussed over a good meal. Rebecca sat across from Nathaniel and answered his questions about the ranch ledgers with the same composure she brought to everything. He was attentive. He was pleasant. He asked her opinion about the fall market prices and actually listened to her answer. And she felt nothing particular. After dinner, while Nathaniel and Silas moved to the porch to talk contracts, Rebecca cleared the table. She carried the dishes through the kitchen door and nearly walked directly into Caleb Mercer, who had come in through the back to return a tool he'd borrowed from the kitchen supply shelf that morning. She stopped. He stopped. Neither of them spoke for half a second. "I'll be out of your way," he said. "You're not in it." He set the tool on the shelf, and she noticed his hands. The left one had a fresh cut across 2 knuckles wrapped in a strip of cloth that wasn't clean anymore. He hadn't asked anyone to look at it. He'd wrapped it himself and kept working. "You should have someone look at that hand," she said. "It's fine. It's infected if you leave it another day." He glanced down at it, then back at her, and there was something in his expression, not embarrassment exactly, but the look of a man who had been managing small discomforts alone for so long that being noticed for one felt strange to him. "I'll see to it," he said. "The medicine cabinet is in the hall." "Miss Bell." He said her name quietly, not coldly. "Thank you." He left through the back door. She stood in the kitchen and listened to her father laugh at something Nathaniel had said on the porch, and she thought about the way Caleb Mercer had looked at his own injured hand, not with self-pity, but with the mild acknowledgement of a man who had learned not to expect anyone to notice. She didn't know what to do with that thought, so she filed it away and went to join her father and their guest. 3 weeks passed in the particular rhythm of ranch work in early October. Caleb had settled into Bellweather, the way water settles into stone quietly, with no announcement, but leaving its mark in the shape of things around it. He repaired the south fence without being asked, identified a lame mare's leg problem before the horse went completely lame, and reorganized the feed storage in a way that cut the morning preparation time by 20 minutes. Holt, who had started by barely tolerating him, now deferred to his read on the cattle without quite admitting he was doing it. Rebecca watched all of it. She watched because watching was what she did. She had been watching Bellweather Ranch run itself since she was 16, since her mother's coffin was lowered into the Texas soil, and her father's grief folded in on itself and came out the other side as authority. She knew every man on that property knew which ones worked harder when they thought they were observed, and which ones worked the same, whether anyone was looking or not. Caleb Mercer worked the same. She found herself looking for him in the mornings, which annoyed her. She found herself noting which problems he had solved before she'd gotten around to logging them in the ledger, which irritated her more. And she found herself twice beginning to say something to him and then stopping herself, because what she wanted to say wasn't about ranch work, and she was old enough and practical enough to know that wanting was not the same as wise. Nathaniel Price wrote her a letter. A proper letter on good paper delivered by post asking whether he might call on her again when next he had occasion to visit San Antonio on business. The letter was well composed. His penmanship was neat. He expressed himself with the careful dignity of a man who had thought about what he was saying before he wrote it. She wrote back that she would be pleased to receive him. Her father read the letter over her shoulder, not slyly, but with the open interest of a man who didn't understand why his approval would need to be concealed, and said, "He's a good man, Rebecca. I know he is, Father. He'd provide well. I expect he would." Silas looked at her. "That isn't an objection." She sealed the envelope. "It isn't a decision either." And then came the afternoon that changed the temperature of everything. Warren Pike rode on to Bellweather looking for Silas on a matter of fence lines and ended up standing near the barn when Caleb led a horse past him. Pike was one of the older ranchers in the county, the kind of man who remembered everything about everyone and kept it sorted by usefulness. He looked at Caleb, and his expression shifted the way a face shifts when a name surfaces from somewhere it had been buried. "Mercer." Caleb stopped. "Caleb Mercer." Pike said it the second time like he was verifying a measurement. "I'll be damned. Thought no decent outfit would hire you after Red Fork." The yard went quiet. Holt stood near the water barrel and didn't move. Two younger hands stopped walking without appearing to decide to stop. Rebecca was crossing from the supply shed to the house, and she heard every word. Caleb said nothing. He held the horse's lead. He looked at Pike the way a man looks at weather, observing it, not fighting it. Pike continued, and his voice had the comfortable cruelty of someone who doesn't realize what cruelty sounds like because he's only ever experienced it as honesty. "Heard you lost men and cattle both and couldn't account for either. Walked off a drive and left the outfit to manage its own disaster." Still nothing from Caleb. "You got something to say to that, son?" "No, sir." Pike squinted at him. "No defense at all?" "None I'm offering." Pike made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite contempt, somewhere between the two, and walked toward the house to find Silas. Rebecca stood in the yard. Her pen was in her hand. She had been carrying it from the supply shed, and she was still holding it, and she realized she hadn't moved in 30 seconds. Caleb led the horse into the barn without looking back at her. She went to the house. She sat at the ledger. She wrote 3 numbers in the wrong column, noticed it, crossed them out, and sat very still for a moment. That evening she went to the barn. He was checking the mare's leg, his back to the door, and he didn't hear her until she spoke. "What happened at Red Fork?" He straightened up slowly, turned. She watched him decide something, not whether to answer, but how much of the truth to give, and in what shape to give it. "A man drowned," he said. "Cattle were lost. Mr. Pike said you walked off the drive. He said what he was told. And what's the difference?" Caleb turned back to the mare. He ran his hand along the horse's leg with the same patient attention he gave everything. "A man died under my responsibility. That's the part I don't argue with. That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm willing to give." She stood there. The lantern pushed his shadow long and flat across the ground behind him, and she looked at the shape of him, the way he held himself steady and contained, like a man who had already absorbed a blow. This conversation was just now reaching, and she felt something shift in her chest that she recognized and did not particularly welcome. "You could defend yourself," she said, "if you wanted to." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know." "Then why don't you?" He set down the cloth he'd been using on the mare's leg and turned fully to face her. Not with anger, not with the defensive posture of a man who's been accused, just with a directness that was almost uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of. "Miss Bell," his voice was even, "there are things a man keeps to himself not because he's hiding them, but because saying them out loud costs someone else more than his own silence costs him." She stared at him. "That doesn't make any sense." "No." He picked up his hat. "It probably doesn't." And he walked past her out of the barn, and she stood alone with the mare and the lantern, and a feeling in her chest that was equal parts frustration and something she refused to name. She told herself she was angry at his refusal to explain. That was partly true. What she didn't tell herself not yet was that she was frightened by how much she wanted the explanation to be something she could respect. 2 days later, she found the pamphlet. Everyone on the property believed the new trail hand retired early. Rebecca had come down for water past midnight because the August heat lingered even in October in the Texas Hill Country, and the house held it long after dark. The kitchen light was on, which was wrong. She stopped in the doorway. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a half-empty glass of water and a small printed pamphlet open in front of him. He was reading with the absorbed, annotating attention of a man who was not reading casually, but studying his finger, tracing a line, backing up, reading it again. The pamphlet, she could see from 2 feet away, was a veterinary paper on equine leg stress fractures. There were penciled notes in the margin in his own hand. She didn't mean to make a sound. She did. He looked up. She looked at the pamphlet, at his penciled notes, at his expression, which did not scramble into anything defensive, but simply settled into the quiet awareness that he had been seen doing something he had not advertised. "Where did you learn to read like that?" she asked. He didn't move. "Like what?" "Like it matters." He closed the pamphlet slowly, set it flat on the table, and when he looked at her, his eyes had something in them that they didn't usually carry out in the yard or the barn, something closer to the actual person behind the careful stillness. "Before I learned it was sometimes better not to tell people everything you know." She sat down across from him without being invited. She pulled the pamphlet toward her and looked at the penciled notes, precise, technical, cross-referenced to a page number in another text that wasn't on the table. "This isn't a cowboy's reading material," she said. "No." "Then what were you before you were a cowboy?" He was quiet for exactly as long as a man is quiet when he's deciding which truth to tell. A careful one. She looked up, and she nearly asked him something else, something that would have crossed a line she was still aware enough to recognize. And instead, she set the pamphlet back in front of him and returned to her room without another word. She lay awake for 2 hours, not because of Nathaniel Price's letter, not because of her father's hopes and the good china and the linen napkins, but because of a man who took careful notes in a worn notebook and wrote in the margins of veterinary pamphlets at midnight and had been called a coward in broad daylight by a man who didn't know the half of it and hadn't said a single word in his own defense. The next morning, Silas summoned her to the study. Howe was standing at the window when she came in. He didn't sit, which meant the conversation was one he wanted to control the length of. He had heard about Pike's comment. He had seen Rebecca go to the barn that evening. He did not know what had passed between her and Caleb, but he knew his daughter, and he knew the particular quality of silence she had worn at breakfast. "Rebecca." "Father, I want to ask you something directly." She waited. "Is there something between you and that trail hand?" "No." The word was true. Then she added, because she was her mother's daughter and could not be dishonest with the parts of truth that mattered, "Not in the way you mean." Silas looked at her for a long moment. He didn't press. He was not a fool. He understood that "not in the way you mean" was the beginning of something, not the end of it. He didn't say anything else that morning. But that evening after supper, he walked to the barn. Caleb was finishing the last of the evening tasks. Silas waited until the 2 younger hands had gone before he pulled the barn door mostly closed and turned. Caleb looked up. Neither man spoke for a moment. Silas stood with his arms at his sides, not aggressive, but with the deliberate stillness of a man who has made a decision he wants to present as reasonable, even when he knows it isn't quite. "I know about the Red Fork Drive," Silas said. Caleb straightened. His face did something, a slight change in the set of his jaw, a quieting of the already quiet eyes, but he didn't look away. "Then you know enough to dislike me," Caleb said. "I know a man drowned. I know cattle were lost. I know you walked away from a drive your employer was counting on and let that employer take the loss alone. Is that what you know?" "It's what the men who were there say." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression held a quality that Silas couldn't quite place, not anger, not self-pity, something quieter and more unsettling, like a man standing in front of a door he has chosen not to open. "Then you know what you need to know," Caleb said. "What I know." Silas replied, his voice dropping to the register menus when they want their words to carry without being overheard. "Is that my daughter went to the barn 2 nights ago to ask you about it. And this morning, she had the look of a woman who didn't sleep." Silence. "Mr. Mercer." Silas pulled his gloves off and held them in one hand, the gesture of a man settling in. "I have one daughter. I raised her without her mother for 11 years. I have spent every one of those years trying to protect her from exactly the kind of trouble that walks onto a property without references and a reputation that won't account for itself." Caleb said nothing. "Stay away from my daughter." The barn held the sound of the 2 horses shifting in their stalls and nothing else. Caleb removed his own gloves. He held them. He looked at Silas Bell the way a man looks at someone he has decided to respect, even while disagreeing with everything they've just said. "If Miss Bell asks me a question about ranch work," he said, "I'll answer it." Silas stepped closer. "I'm not talking about ranch work." "I know." "Then do I make myself plain?" Caleb held his gaze. "You make yourself very plain." "Good." Silas started for the door. "And if she asks me something that isn't ranch work—" Silas stopped. He turned back. His jaw tightened by a fraction. "Then you'll recall that this is my ranch, and you're here on my word, and I can take back my word any morning I choose." Caleb held the gaze. "Then I'll leave." He said it without heat, without ultimatum. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had accepted harder things than this and walked away from them with his character intact. Silas looked at him for 3 long seconds. "Don't make me ask you twice," he said, and he left. Caleb stood in the barn with the 2 horses and the lantern. He put his gloves back on. He finished the water check. He made a note in his small, worn notebook, not about the conversation, but about the lame mare's improving gait, because the mare's leg didn't care what had just happened between 2 men and needed attending to regardless. But his hand was slower than usual. He wrote the note, closed the notebook, and looked at the barn wall for a long moment. Rebecca was standing on the far side of the barn door. She had been there for the last half of the conversation. She had not moved. She had come down to check on the mare, which was the truth, the complete truth, the truth she would have told anyone, and she had heard her father's voice and stopped, and then she had heard Caleb's, and she had not left. She heard every word. She heard her father describe her as something to be protected from. She heard him deploy the ranch like a weapon. She heard Caleb say, "Then I'll leave," in a voice that carried no anger and no plea, just the steady acceptance of a man who knew his own worth and didn't need the room to agree with him. She stepped back from the door before Caleb came out. She stood in the dark for a moment. Her father thought he was protecting her. Caleb thought he was honoring the request of the man who had hired him, and neither of them, she realized, had once thought to speak to her. She went back to the house. She sat at her ledger in the lamplight. She opened it to the November feed projections and looked at the margin note she had written in her own hand, the drainage observation Caleb had made in the pasture 3 weeks ago, the one that would prevent a grazing problem no one else had caught. She didn't close the ledger. She sat with it open, and she thought a man who won't explain himself and a father who won't let her choose. And the question that sat in the center of her chest, quiet and unmoving and entirely her own: which one of them thinks they're deciding for my sake, and which one of them is deciding for his? She did not sleep well that night, and she was not accustomed to not sleeping well. Rebecca Bell had managed this ranch's books through drought years and cattle fever scares and a lawsuit over water rights that had taken 2 years and her father's best lawyer to resolve. She had learned early that sleeplessness was a luxury she could not afford, and she had trained herself out of it the way you train a horse out of shying, with patience and repetition, and a firm refusal to reward the habit. But she lay awake, and the thing keeping her awake was not worry. It was the particular discomfort of a woman who has discovered that 2 men she respects have been making quiet decisions on her behalf and calling it protection. She was at the ledger before first light. Martha found her there an hour later and said nothing, because Martha had known Rebecca since she was 16 and understood that a woman working silently at a ledger before sunrise was either solving a problem or becoming one, and either way, it was best not to ask yet. She poured coffee, set it beside the ledger, Left. Rebecca looked at the drainage note she'd written in the margin 3 weeks ago. Caleb's observation. Her handwriting. The small collision of two careful people in a pasture. She turned to a fresh page and wrote nothing for a long moment. Then she wrote, "What is he not telling us, and why?" She underlined it. Set the pen down. She had grown up in a household where questions were answered or deflected, but never simply refused. Her father answered everything, sometimes bluntly, sometimes after a long pause, but always eventually. Her mother, from what she remembered, and what Martha had filled in over the years, had been the same. Directness was a family trait, and Rebecca wore it like good boots, broken and comfortable, not something she thought about until it failed her. Caleb Mercer's refusal to explain himself was the first thing in years that her directness couldn't get through. And the thing that kept her awake wasn't his silence. It was the fact that his silence didn't feel like dishonesty. It felt like weight. By mid-morning, she had finished the quarterly supply tallies and caught 2 arithmetic errors in Holt's feed cost estimates, which she corrected without comment and returned to the correct column. She was rolling the ledger closed when she heard boots on the porch steps. Not her father's stride, not Holt's heavy, deliberate tread, and she knew before she looked up. Caleb knocked on the open doorframe. He was holding a folded piece of paper. "Holt asked me to bring this to you." He held it out. "The water usage numbers from the south tank for October. He said you'd want them before you finish the monthly summary." She took it, unfolded it, looked at the numbers. "These are in your handwriting." Holt's writing tends toward optimism. She looked up sharply. Caleb's expression carried something that was almost humor. Not a smile, nothing that broad, but a slight loosening around the eyes that told her he was aware of the irony and had decided she was the kind of woman who would catch it. "He asked me to write them down as he read them," Caleb added, straight-faced. "The numbers are his, the legibility is mine." She looked back at the paper. The numbers were precisely recorded, each one followed by a secondary notation. She hadn't asked for comparison to the previous month's usage, the percentage change, and a brief note about what might account for the difference. She had not asked for any of that. "I didn't request the comparison data," she said. "I know. But you included it. You would have needed it anyway." She set the paper on the ledger and looked at him directly. He stood in the doorway, as he always did, not entering without invitation, not retreating either, simply present in the particular way he was present everywhere on this property, useful without being obtrusive, observant without performing observation. "Mr. Mercer," she kept her voice level, "were you given specific instructions about keeping your distance from this house?" Something crossed his face. Not guilt. Not the flush of a man caught in something he shouldn't be doing. Something quieter. The acknowledgement of a man who has received a specific instruction, understands why it was given, and is now being asked about it by the one person the instruction was designed to protect. "Yes, ma'am." "And yet here you are." "Holt asked me to deliver the numbers." Holt, she said carefully, could have delivered them himself. Caleb held her gaze. A long pause. He could have. She let that sit between them for a moment. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." "I'll give you the best one I can." "That's not a yes." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She set her pen flat on the ledger. "What happened at Red Fork, not what a man died and cattle were lost. What actually happened." He looked at her, the way a man looks at a door. He's kept locked for a long time, not with reluctance exactly. More with the tired recognition of someone who has stood at this particular door before and walked away from it and is now being asked to stand here again and consider whether the cost of opening it is different today than it was yesterday. "A river rose faster than the forecast said it would," he said. "The herd needed to cross. The owner said go. I said wait. And he didn't wait." She was very still. "Then what?" "Then I tried to stop it. Couldn't. And afterward, when it came to who'd made the call..." He paused, just briefly. "The man who'd made the call wasn't the man who got blamed for it." She looked at him. "You could prove that." It wasn't a question. She said it flat, the way you state something you've already worked out. He said nothing. "You could prove it," she said again quietly. "And you haven't." "No." "Why?" And this time the pause was different. Not the pause of a man choosing how much to say. The pause of a man who has decided not to say the thing that would explain everything, because saying it would cost someone else something he has no right to cost them. "I have my reasons," he said. "They're good ones." That's exactly what a man says when he knows his reasons will sound better kept quiet. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was even. "It is." She picked up her pen, set it down again, looked at the water usage numbers with their careful comparison columns and their secondary notations that she hadn't asked for. "My father told you to stay away from this house." "He did." "Are you going to—" He held her gaze for exactly as long as it took her to understand that the answer to that question was more complicated than either yes or no, and that he knew it, and that he was not going to pretend otherwise. "I work for your father," he said. "I'll respect what he's asked. And if I ask you something, then I'll answer." He picked up his hat. "Good morning, Miss Bell." He walked back across the yard, and Rebecca sat at the ledger, and the water usage numbers, with their careful secondary columns, sat in front of her, and she stared at them for a long time without reading a single figure. She wrote Nathaniel Price's letter that afternoon, not because she had decided anything, because her father was watching her, and she was not going to let him see her refuse a reasonable courtesy from a reasonable man on the basis of feelings she hadn't yet named. Nathaniel had asked to call on her. She had agreed. That agreement stood, and she was going to honor it, because she was not the kind of woman who undid her own word, because something uncomfortable had come along to confuse her. She sealed the letter and gave it to the postwriter without second-guessing it. But her hand was slightly slower than usual when she let it go. Nathaniel arrived 12 days later. He came again in the well-kept buggy. The boots were clean. The coat was pressed. He brought a small box of good chocolates from San Antonio with a card that was written in his own hand, not a shop inscription, and he gave it to her directly with the straightforward warmth of a man who was not performing courtesy but simply practicing it. He was good. That was the honest word for it. Nathaniel Price was a good man. He sat with her and Silas on the porch after supper and talked about the fall market with the easy intelligence of someone who understood the cattle trade down to its margins. He asked Rebecca's opinion about the winter pricing outlook, and when she gave it specifically with numbers, he didn't soften his attention the way some men did when a woman spoke precisely. He listened, considered, and said she was right about the eastern markets, but that the San Antonio commission houses were absorbing the difference in a way that might complicate her projection. She revised her position on the spot. He accepted the revision without triumph. She sat beside him and felt comfortable and calm and completely, utterly unmoved. And she noticed from across the yard without meaning to notice that Caleb had not come near the house since the morning with the water numbers. How was working the south fence. She could see him in the last of the evening light, the set of his shoulders, the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had been asked to keep his distance, and was keeping it not with resentment, but with the precise dignity of someone who respects a line, even when it costs him something. Nathaniel asked her something. She turned back. "I'm sorry. I asked whether you'd thought any more about the spring drive. Your father mentioned you might want to join the advance discussion this year." "I have thought about it," she said. "I have some questions about the commission structure." And she answered him, and she was present, and she was courteous, and she was everything her father had hoped she would be. But once, just once, she let herself look back across the yard. Howe was gone. The fence line was empty. The evening had come in fully and taken him somewhere she couldn't see. She looked back at Nathaniel. The next morning, Caleb was not at breakfast with the hands. She didn't ask. She checked the ledger. She handled the supply order. She did not ask. By mid-morning, she had found a discrepancy in the hay delivery weights from the month before 14 bales, short of what was invoiced, which meant either the delivery man had made an error or Bellweather had been paying for hay it hadn't received. She pulled the past 3 months of delivery records, spread them on the table, and began going back through them. Martha came in, looked at the spread of papers, and said, "You've got that face." "What face?" "The one that means you found something that's going to be unpleasant to tell your father." I found a delivery discrepancy. How much? Enough. Martha sat down across from her. Rebecca. It's a billing error. I'm not talking about the hay. Rebecca kept her eyes on the records. Then what are you talking about? Martha was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she was quiet when she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to actually say. I'm talking about the fact that you've looked out that window 6 times in the last hour, and each time you do it, your pen stops moving. Rebecca did not look up. I'm checking on the south fence repair. The new split rail sections need to set properly or the cattle push through. That's ranch work. Of course it is. Martha stood, refilled her coffee cup. He's working the water tank repair today, the east side, not the south, in case you needed to know where not to look. She left the kitchen. Rebecca sat with the delivery records for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and finished the tally. The discrepancy was real. 14 bales across 3 months, always on the Tuesday delivery, always the same driver. She wrote it up in clear figures, attached the original invoices, and set it on her father's desk with a note that said in her plainest handwriting, "We have been paying for hay we have not received." The pattern suggests this is not accidental. Silas read it at noon. His face went through 3 stages in about 5 seconds. How long has this been going on? At least 3 months, possibly longer. I'd need to pull last year's records to be certain. Why didn't Holt catch it? Because Holt trusts the invoice. Silas set the paper down. He looked at her, not with the mild approval he showed when she managed the household accounts, but with the look of a man who has just been reminded that his daughter's contribution to this ranch is not decorative. "I'll handle the driver," he said. "I've already drafted a letter to the supply house." He looked at her. "I can hold it if you'd rather write your own," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Let me read yours first." She gave him the letter. He read it. Made one change, a word in the second paragraph that she agreed was better than her original, and handed it back. "Send it," he said. She was halfway to the door when he said, "Rebecca." She turned. He looked like he was going to say something about Nathaniel, about the visit, about the spring drive discussion. She could see him organizing it. "Good work," he said instead. She nodded. "Thank you, Father." And she went back to her ledger. The letter went out that afternoon. The delivery driver was dismissed by the supply house within the week, and Silas Bell sat in his study that evening and looked at the wall for a longer time than usual, thinking about something, although he would not have been able to say precisely what. It was Martha who named it for him. She came to the study doorway that evening after supper, when Rebecca had gone upstairs and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. "Are you protecting her from a bad man?" Martha said from the doorway without preamble, because she was his sister and she had earned the right to say things without preamble. "Or are you protecting her from making a choice you didn't make for her?" Silas looked up. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." He set down the report he'd been not quite reading. "He has no roots, Martha, no references, a reputation that nobody can account for on his side, and yet he caught what nobody else caught in the supply invoices." Silas frowned. That was Rebecca. Rebecca caught it because she'd been watching how carefully he documented things. Martha came fully into the room. "She's had that method in her head for 2 weeks, Silas. She didn't pull those invoices because she's always pulled invoices. She pulled them because she'd learned from watching a man who writes down everything twice and trusts nothing he hasn't verified." Silas was quiet. "She's learning from him," Martha said. "That's what you're actually afraid of. Not that he'll take her away. That she'll become more herself, and that person will make choices you wouldn't make for her." "That's not fair." "No," Martha agreed gently. "It isn't, but it's true." She left him to sit with it. He sat with it for some time. The shift came 4 days later, and it came the way the worst revelations always come sideways, from a direction no one was watching. A man arrived at Bellweather on a gray horse road, dusted and travel-worn, asking for Holt. He gave his name as Dawson, a rider out of the hill country east of San Antonio, in the employ of a rancher named Carruthers. He had a message about a cattle contract, he said, and he needed to speak to whoever handled the business decisions. Silas received him in the yard. The message was straightforward, a contract inquiry, nothing unusual. But while Silas and Dawson talked through the terms Dawson mentioned in the easy way men mention things they consider common knowledge, that he'd ridden up through Gillespie County and stopped overnight at a spread there. "Fellow there told me he'd seen the Red Fork inquest papers," Dawson said in the tone of a man making conversation. "Said there was a foreman name of Mercer took full blame for the crossing call. Signed his own statement to that effect." Silas went very still. "Signed his own statement," he repeated. "That's what the fellow said. Said Mercer wrote it up himself. Said there were other witnesses, but he told them to stay out of it and took the whole thing on his own account." Dawson had no particular interest in the story. He moved on to the contract terms. Silas answered the right questions and shook the right hand and said he'd send a response by post within a week. He stood in the yard for a long time after Dawson left. A man who signed his own statement placing the blame on himself. A man who by Pike's telling and everyone else's had walked away from that drive in disgrace. A man who had stood in his barn 2 weeks ago and said, "Then you know enough to dislike me," with the complete stillness of someone who had chosen that response rather than been forced into it. Silas went looking for Caleb. He found him at the water tank, the east side, exactly where Martha had said, which meant Martha knew his work schedule, which meant something about how carefully people on this property were observing this man that Silas was not sure he'd fully reckoned with. Mercer. Caleb looked up, straightened. "A man named Dawson came through from Gillespie County today." No change in Caleb's expression. "He mentioned the Red Fork inquest." Silas watched his face. "He mentioned a foreman who signed his own statement." The silence between them had a different quality than before. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say. The silence of a man who has just been told that a locked door has been found and is standing very still while he decides whether to open it or simply acknowledge that it's there. "Mr. Bell," Caleb's voice was low, "that inquest is closed." "I'm not asking about the inquest." "Then what are you asking?" Silas looked at him. Really looked the way he hadn't quite allowed himself to, before, the way you look at something when you've been deliberately looking slightly past it for weeks. He saw the weathering that came from honest outdoor work, not the dissipation of a man running from something. He saw hands that were marked with labor, not idleness. He saw eyes that met his directly, which they always had, and he realized that a man who is guilty of what Caleb Mercer had been accused of does not generally look a man in the eye, this steadily, this long, this consistently. "I'm asking," Silas said slowly, "whether the statement you signed was the whole truth." Caleb held his gaze. "No," he said. "It wasn't." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. "Then why did you sign it?" "Because the whole truth would have ruined someone who'd already lost enough." Silas stared at him. "The owner of that outfit," Caleb said, and his voice had the careful, measured quality of a man reading aloud from something he has carried for a long time. "He had a widowed sister. The drover who died, that young man, was her son. She'd already buried her husband the year before. If I'd put the truth in that statement, her brother's outfit would have folded. She'd have had nothing left." Silas said nothing. "I had proof enough to ruin him," Caleb said. "I chose not to use it, and you let people call you a coward instead. People call each other a great many things." Caleb reached down and picked up the tool he'd set on the ground when Silas arrived. "What they call me doesn't change what I did or why." Silas stood in the cooling afternoon air, and something in him shifted, not dramatically, not with the sudden crash of a man having a revelation, but with the slow, settled movement of a man who has been leaning against a door he thought was a wall and has just felt it give. "Why didn't you tell me this?" he said. Caleb looked at him steadily. "Because you didn't ask whether the story was true. You asked me to stay away from your daughter." The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was for the first time honest. Silas nodded once, the nod of a man who has heard something he needs time to carry, and walked back toward the house. He did not look back. Caleb watched him go, then turned back to the water tank, and the sound of the work resumed in the quiet evening air. Rebecca was crossing from the supply shed to the house when her father walked past her. His expression stopped her cold. She had seen her father tired, and she had seen him angry, and she had seen him in the particular silence of grief that he'd carried for years after her mother died. What she saw now was none of those things. It was the face of a man who has just discovered that the map he's been reading was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not off by a creek bed or a fence line, but wrong in the fundamental reading, wrong in what he'd believed was solid ground. "Father?" He stopped, looked at her. "What happened?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at her in a way that was unfamiliar, a way that had something younger in it, something uncertain. The look of a man who is realizing he may have made a mistake too large to simply correct and too recent to know yet how deep it runs. "I may have been working with incomplete information," he said. Rebecca waited. He walked past her into the house. She stood in the yard. Then she turned and looked toward the water tank on the east side of the property, where she could see in the last of the evening light a man working with quiet persistence at a job that needed doing, making notes in a worn notebook that nobody had asked him to keep. She stayed where she was for a long time, and the thing she felt in her chest, the thing she had been naming as frustration and filing away as inconvenient. She let herself feel it fully for just a moment. Just one moment. Standing in the yard in the last of the October light, watching a man who had signed his name to a false account to protect a woman he'd never met, and who had been carrying the weight of it for 4 years without asking for anyone's sympathy. Then she went inside. She sat at the ledger. She opened it to the margin note, the drainage observation, her own handwriting. Caleb's words. She read it once. She closed the ledger. And for the first time since he'd arrived at Bellweather Ranch 6 weeks ago, Rebecca Bell admitted to herself that the careful distance she had been keeping was not and had never been for her father's sake. It was because she had known for some time that if she crossed it, she would not be coming back, and she was not yet sure whether that frightened her or not. But she thought about it long into the night while the ledger sat closed on the desk and the house held its nighttime quiet around her. She was still thinking about it when she finally slept. She woke before dawn with the particular clarity that follows a night of hard thinking. Not the foggy half-rest of a troubled mind, but the sharp, clean wakefulness of a woman who has worked something through in her sleep and arrived at the morning with her conclusions already set. She dressed without lighting the lamp. She went downstairs quietly, put water on for coffee, and stood at the kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn, looking at nothing, thinking about everything. Her father knew something. Something had shifted in him yesterday evening. She'd seen it in his face, in the way he'd walked past her without his usual composure, in the 3 words he'd offered that weren't quite an explanation, but weren't quite a deflection either. Incomplete information. Silas Bell was a man who dealt in complete information. He didn't use that phrase lightly. I used it when he'd discovered he'd been wrong about something significant and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. She poured her coffee and waited. Martha came down at first light, took one look at Rebecca's face, and poured herself a cup without comment. They sat together in the kitchen quiet for several minutes before Rebecca said, "Did Father speak to you last evening?" "He came to the study," Martha said. "Sat with his report without reading it for about 40 minutes, then went to bed. He didn't say anything. He said good night." Rebecca held her cup. "Something happened yesterday. A rider came through. Father spoke to him in the yard." Martha looked at her over the rim of her cup. "And then your father went and spoke to Mr. Mercer at the water tank." Rebecca went still. "You saw that?" "I see most things that happen in this yard." Martha set her cup down. "What I don't see is what was said." "Neither do I." They sat with that for a moment. "Rebecca." Martha's voice was careful. "Whatever your father learned or didn't learn yesterday, what is it you want to know? Not what he found out. What do you want to know?" Rebecca set her cup on the table. "I want to know why a man would sign his own name to something false to protect a woman he'd never met, and then spend 4 years letting people think less of him for it." Martha was quiet. "I want to know," Rebecca continued, and her voice stayed even. Whether that's the kind of man who does that once and never again, or whether it's the kind of man he is every single time. Martha looked at her for a long moment. And why does that question matter to you so particularly? Rebecca picked up her cup. It doesn't, she said. And they both knew it was the least true thing she'd said in weeks. She found out what the rider had brought before noon. Not from her father, who was closeted with Holt over the cattle tally most of the morning. From Holt's youngest hand, a loose-tongued boy of 19 named Eddie, who didn't understand that information had weight until after he'd already set it down in front of someone. He mentioned the name Dawson while he was loading fence supplies. He mentioned Gillespie County. He mentioned, without realizing what he was doing, the phrase inquest papers and the name Mercer in the same breath, and Rebecca stopped walking and asked him what exactly he'd heard, and Eddie, who was not a malicious boy, told her everything Dawson had told Silas, word for word, because he had a good memory and no filter, and thought Miss Bell asked because she needed to know for ranch business. She thanked him. She walked back to the house. She sat at the ledger and did not open it. Caleb had signed his own statement. He had written in his own hand a version of Red Fork that placed the blame on himself. He had done it knowing it was incomplete. He had done it to protect the dead drover's mother from losing the only family she had left. And then he had walked away from that outfit and every outfit after it, carrying a reputation that wasn't his, and he had not said a single word in his own defense in 4 years. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the kitchen table at midnight, the veterinary pamphlet. Before I learned it was sometimes better not to tell people everything you know. She thought about the south pasture, the water trough, 3 cattle that weren't sick. She thought about his hands, the cut on his knuckles that he'd wrapped himself because he didn't expect anyone to notice. She thought, he didn't protect himself. He protected her. And then she thought, he's been doing that his whole life, hasn't he? Protecting people who don't know they're being protected, and letting himself take the damage so they don't have to. The thought should have made her admire him unreservedly. What it actually did was make her angry, not at him, or not only at him. At all of it, at the structure of things, at the way a man could sign his name to a lie out of genuine goodness, and have that goodness look to everyone who didn't know the whole story like cowardice. At the way silence chosen for the right reasons became indistinguishable from silence chosen for the wrong ones. At the fact that Caleb Mercer had been living inside that indistinguishable silence for 4 years and hadn't apparently lost any sleep over it. She picked up her pen, set it down, stood, sat back down. Then she heard the horse in the yard. Not a ranch horse. A traveler's horse. The particular sound of an animal that has come a long distance and knows it's arrived somewhere. She looked out the window and saw a man she didn't recognize tying up at the post. Older, thick through the chest, weathered the way men who spent their lives outdoors were weathered. He was carrying a saddlebag and an oilcloth packet tied with cord, and he was asking Eddie where he could find a man named Caleb Mercer. Rebecca was out the door before she'd decided to move. She reached the yard as Caleb came around from the back of the barn. She watched him stop. She watched something move through his face, recognition, and then something more complicated than recognition. Something between relief and the particular dread of a person who has been waiting for a reckoning and has just seen it arrive on a gray horse. Thomas, Caleb said. The older man, Thomas Rourke. Though Rebecca didn't know his name yet, looked at him with the complicated warmth of someone who has carried a guilty conscience for a long time and is tired of the wait. Been looking for you 6 months, Rourke said. You don't make it easy. I didn't intend to make it easy or hard. Caleb's voice was careful. I just moved on. I know. Rourke held up the oilcloth packet. I have something that belongs to you, or should have belonged to you 4 years ago. Caleb looked at the packet. He didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's been told is good news, but hasn't yet decided to believe. What's in it? Caleb asked, though Rebecca would have bet everything she owned that he already knew. Jesse Whitmore's journal, Rourke said, his own account of the drive. Wrote it right up until the morning of the crossing. He paused. And 2 signed statements, mine and Danny Hargett's. What we both saw written down and witnessed by a notary in San Antonio last month. Silence. And your original written objection to crossing the river, Rourke continued, which I have kept for 4 years because I didn't know what else to do with it, and I couldn't throw it away. The yard was completely still. Caleb still hadn't reached for the packet. Thomas. His voice was low. Agnes Whitmore is still alive. She is. Rourke held the packet steady. She's also the one who asked me to find you. That stopped everything. Caleb looked at him. What? Jesse's mother. Rourke's voice had gone quieter. She found out what you did. About the statement. About why. He took a breath. It took her 3 years to find out, and when she did, she wasn't. He stopped. Started again. She doesn't want your protection, Caleb. She never asked for it. And she doesn't want you carrying what you're carrying because of her. The silence between them was thick with everything that had been unsaid for 4 years. Caleb finally reached out. He took the packet. He held it without opening it, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were very steady, and he looked like a man who has just been handed back something he'd given away, believing he'd never see it again. Rebecca stood 5 feet away and watched all of it. Caleb turned, and he saw her. She didn't look away. He looked at her face, which was not neutral, had not been neutral for some time, and which right now held the expression of a woman who has just watched the last piece of a puzzle slide into place, and is still working out whether the picture it makes is what she expected. He looked back at Rourke. Come inside. I'll have someone get you water and something to eat. I'd appreciate that. Caleb turned back to Rebecca. His voice was quiet. Miss Bell. Mr. Mercer. Her voice was quieter. A pause. Would you tell your father we have a guest? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and went inside. Silas came out of the study at her knock. She told him plainly a man named Thomas Rourke had arrived looking for Caleb Mercer, and he was carrying documents from the Red Fork inquest. Silas's expression didn't change much. He'd already heard Dawson's account, already had the conversation by the water tank, already sat with his incomplete information overnight. But something in his eyes sharpened in a way that told her this mattered to him. He went to the porch. Martha, who had been in the kitchen and had heard everything, appeared in the doorway without being summoned, because Martha always appeared without being summoned when it mattered. They gathered Silas and Martha on the porch, Rebecca in the doorway, Rourke sitting on the porch steps with his hat in his hands, and Caleb standing near the post still holding the oilcloth packet still unopened. Mr. Rourke, Silas said, you were at Red Fork. I was. And you've written a statement. A true one. Rourke looked up at him directly. Which is more than got written 4 years ago. Silas looked at Caleb. Open it. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he untied the cord and unfolded the oilcloth. Inside were 3 documents. The worn small journal, 2 folded pages of witness statement, and a single sheet that was older than the rest, the edges softened from years of handling. He held the last sheet out to Silas without reading it. My original objection, written the morning before the crossing. Silas took it, read it. His face went through something private. He handed it to Rebecca without a word. She read it. It was brief, direct, and dated. Caleb's handwriting, she recognized it from the water usage numbers, from the margin of the veterinary pamphlet. He had written in plain language that the river level was dangerous, that the cattle were exhausted, that he recommended a delay of 24 hours, and that he was recording his objection for the formal record. Signed. Dated. The morning before, a young man drowned. She looked up. Read the journal, Rourke said to no one in particular. The last 3 entries. Jesse wrote down everything. Silas took the journal. He stood on the porch and read it slowly, and the yard was very quiet around him, and his face as he read was the face of a man who is dismantling something he built over a long time and doing it piece by piece. When he finished, he lowered the journal and looked at Caleb. You rode back into that water, Silas said. Twice. 2 men were in trouble, and you brought them out. One of them. Silas stared at him. The journal says 2 men. Danny Hargett made it to the bank himself. I steadied his horse and pulled him level. Whether that counts as pulling him out is a matter of definition. Rourke said quietly, "It counts." Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer exactly, but lower, the register of a man choosing his words because the wrong ones would be inadequate. "You let them call you a coward." Caleb looked at him steadily. "Words don't bury a man. His mother had already buried enough." The sentence landed in the yard like something physical. Martha put her hand on the doorframe. Rebecca looked at Caleb's face. Really looked the way she'd been careful not to, the way she'd been keeping herself from for weeks, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Not pride, not vindication. Just the same steady quiet she had seen every single day since he'd arrived at Bellweather. The same quality. Unchanged by the documents in his hand, or the witness sitting on the porch steps, or the fact that everything he'd refused to defend was now finally being defended for him. How was the same? Exactly the same. And that told her more about him than the documents did. Silas looked at the journal in his hand. Then he looked at Caleb. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" "Because you didn't ask whether the story was true." Caleb's voice was even. "You asked me to stay away from your daughter." The words hit the air and stayed there. Silas opened his mouth, closed it, and Rebecca said from the doorway, in a voice that was very calm and very clear, "And nobody asked me anything at all." Both men turned to look at her. She wasn't angry. Or rather, she was angry. But the anger had the particular quality of a woman who has had time to organize it, who knows exactly where it lives and what it's made of, and isn't going to let it come out sideways. She stepped fully onto the porch. "Mr. Rourke," she said first, "thank you for making this journey. Please go inside and Martha will see that you're fed and rested." She waited while Rourke stood, nodded, and followed Martha through the door. Then she turned to the two men remaining. She looked at her father first. "You heard from a traveler yesterday that there was more to the Red Fork story than you'd been told. And then you went and spoke to Mr. Mercer at the water tank. You learned something. And this morning, you went back into your study with your report. You weren't reading, and you didn't come to me." Silas had the look of a man who has been found out and knows it. "I was working out how to tell me," she said. "Or how to decide what to do with what you'd learned." He didn't answer. She turned to Caleb. "You signed a false statement to protect a woman you'd never met. You spent 4 years accepting a reputation that wasn't yours. You came to Bellweather with your head down and your work clean, and you kept every document in that packet because somewhere you knew eventually the truth would matter." She paused. "And you never once thought to tell me." "Miss Bell, not because you didn't trust me," she continued, "because you'd already decided I shouldn't have to carry it." She let that sit for one beat. "Just like my father decided I shouldn't have to choose. Just like you both have been deciding very carefully and with the very best intentions what is and isn't mine to know." Caleb was very still. Silas looked at the porch floor. "I am 27 years old," Rebecca said. "I have run these books since I was 16. I caught a billing fraud my father's foreman missed for 3 months. I have been corresponding with cattle commission agents and supply houses and county registrars in my own name for years." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I am not a piece of china on a shelf, and I will not be managed by either of you, not by a father who loves me, and thinks that means choosing for me, and not by a man I—" She stopped. The pause was very brief, but it was there. "A man whose judgment I have come to respect," she finished, "who thinks protecting me means keeping me ignorant." She looked at both of them in turn. "My father decided what was best for me. You decided what was best for me." She took a breath. "Which one of you thought to ask me?" Neither man spoke. She walked back inside. The door didn't slam. That was the worst of it. The door didn't slam. The footsteps didn't pound. There was no storm to discharge the tension. She simply walked inside with complete composure and closed the door quietly behind her, and the two men stood on the porch in the aftermath of a sentence that had not been delivered in anger, but had landed like one regardless. Silas stood with Jesse Whitmore's journal in his hands for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. She's right, Silas said. Not to Caleb particularly, just to the air, the way a man says something when he's acknowledging it first to himself. Caleb looked at the closed door. She's completely right, Silas said again, and his voice was the voice of a man taking something apart that he built wrong the first time. He went inside. Caleb stood alone on the porch. He looked at the oilcloth packet in his hands. He looked at the yard. He looked at the fence line he'd repaired, the water tank he'd fixed, the south pasture he'd documented in his worn notebook, with its secondary notations and its comparison figures that nobody had asked for. I thought about Rebecca Bell in the kitchen doorway at midnight, looking at his penciled notes in the margin of a veterinary pamphlet, with the focused attention of someone who was not surprised by what she saw, but had not been expecting to see it tonight. He thought about the way she'd sat down across from him without being invited, the way she'd pulled the pamphlet toward her and read his notes before she looked back up. He thought about what she'd almost said before she stopped herself. A man He stood on the porch for a long time. Then he went back to work. Because the water tank still needed finishing. Because the lame mare's leg still needed checking. Because the world continued requiring the things it required regardless of what had just happened on a porch in Bexar County on a November afternoon. But his pace was different than it had been that morning. Slower. Not in the way of a man who has lost energy. In the way of a man who is carrying something new, not heavy, exactly, not light either. Something that needed to be set down carefully when the time came. Inside, Silas found Rebecca at the ledger. She was writing. Not the careful, controlled writing she usually did. The pen was moving quickly, and she was not looking fully when the time came. Inside, Silas found Rebecca at the ledger. She was writing. Not the careful, controlled writing she usually did. The pen was moving quickly, and she was not looking up, and he recognized the posture from when she was a child, working through something difficult on her school slate. The set of the jaw, the forward lean, the complete absorption that shut out everything around her. He sat down across from her. She kept writing. Rebecca. She finished the line she was on. Set the pen down. Looked up. Her eyes were dry, clear, composed with the particular composure of a woman who has said what she needed to say and is now past the saying of it. I owe you an apology, Silas said. She waited. I have been. He paused. He was a man who chose words carefully, and right now he was choosing with unusual difficulty, because the right words were the honest ones, and the honest ones required him to admit something that went deeper than a single decision about a single man. I have been making decisions for you that were mine to make only when you were a child, and you have not been a child for a long time. Rebecca looked at him. I heard about the Red Fork documents before Rourke arrived, he said. And when I went and spoke to Mercer yesterday, I didn't tell you because I was still deciding what to think, what it meant, whether I'd been wrong. He held her gaze. I was deciding for you again, even then. The silence between them was gentler than the one on the porch. I know you love me, she said. I have never doubted that. But love isn't management. She picked up her pen. And protection isn't the same as trust. Silas sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man accepting something he can't argue with because he knows it's right. What are you going to do? He asked. She looked at the ledger. What I've always done. My job. He watched her pick up where she'd left off. And the other thing, he said quietly. She didn't look up. That's my business, Father, not yours. A pause. Not yet. He stood. He moved towards the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He's a good man, Rebecca. She wrote a figure in the column, checked it. I know, she said. I've known for some time. He left her there. She sat at the ledger until the afternoon light shifted and the kitchen began to smell like supper and she could hear Martha moving around beyond the wall. Then she closed the ledger, straightened the papers on the desk and stood. She looked at the window. The yard was quiet. The fence line was solid. The south pasture lay in the long November light, and somewhere behind it, the water tank that had been repaired was holding clean, and the drainage that nobody else had noticed was accounted for in the margin of a ranch ledger in her own handwriting. She thought I am not going to run out there and say something I haven't decided to say. She thought I am going to sleep on it. I am going to think about it. I am going to know what I want to say before I say it. She thought, he is not leaving tonight, and I will know what I mean by morning. She went to help Martha with supper. She was entirely calm. She was composed. She moved through the kitchen with her usual quiet efficiency, and she answered Martha's questions about the supply order, and she set the table, and she did not look out the window again. But when they sat down to eat, and her father bowed his head for the blessing, she found herself thinking very briefly, very clearly, in the space between one breath and the next, that she had stopped being afraid of what she wanted. And that was new. That was entirely quietly new. She slept, and she woke with the same clarity she'd had the morning before, except cleaner the way air is cleaner after a storm has moved through and taken the pressure with it. She lay still for a moment and took stock of herself, the way a practical woman takes stock of a situation. What was true, what was decided, what remained undecided, and what she was going to do about each. What was true, Caleb Mercer had spent 4 years carrying a damaged reputation that belonged to someone else, and he had done it for a reason. She understood completely and would not have chosen differently herself. What was decided, she was not going to punish him for protecting her from information because she had said what needed to be said on that porch, and it had been heard, and repeating it would make it smaller. What remained undecided, everything that came after that. Everything that existed in the space between understanding a man's character and knowing what to do with the fact that you understood it. What she was going to do her job. And then when the work was done, and the day had given her time to think, she was going to ride out to wherever he was working and say exactly one thing. She didn't know yet what the thing was, but she would know it when it arrived. She dressed. She went downstairs. She put water on. Thomas Rourke was already in the kitchen. How was an early riser? Clearly, he had found the coffee and poured himself a cup and was sitting at the table with the comfortable ease of a man who has spent enough nights in enough kitchens not to feel like a trespasser in one. He looked up when she came in, and his expression had the slightly abashed quality of a man who has been sitting in someone else's kitchen unsupervised and knows it. "Morning, Miss Bell. Hope you don't mind. Couldn't sleep past 5. "Not at all." She poured her own cup and sat across from him. "How long have you known Caleb?" I didn't seem surprised by the directness. He considered the question. 7 years, give or take. We worked the same outfit 2 seasons running before Red Fork. He turned his cup in his hands. He was foreman quality long before he was ever made foreman. The kind of man you want riding ahead of you, not because he's the biggest or the loudest, but because he always sees the thing coming before you do. And after Red Fork, Rourke's jaw tightened. After Red Fork, I was a coward. He said it flat and clean without cushioning it. I had those statements in my saddlebag, had Jesse's journal, could have come forward the day the inquest closed. Didn't. He looked at this table. Caleb told me to leave it alone, said the cost was too high. But that was his choice to make, not mine to hide behind. Rebecca held her cup. Then why now? Because Agnes Whitmore found out. He looked up. Jesse's mother. She'd heard through a cousin that Caleb had signed a statement that wasn't true, that he'd done it to protect her brother. And she... He stopped. His voice had gone rougher at the edges. She wasn't grateful, Miss Bell. She was furious. Not at Caleb for doing it. At herself for being the reason he'd had to. He took a breath. She came to me. Said she'd spent 2 years looking for him. Said she wouldn't rest until those documents were in his hands where they belonged. Rebecca absorbed that quietly. She sent you, she said. She did. Across how much country? Enough. She looked at this weathered man with his early morning honesty and his 4-year guilty conscience, and thought about the particular kind of courage it took to show up somewhere uninvited, carrying the proof of your own cowardice. Mr. Rourke, she said. Thank you. He shook his head. Don't thank me. I'm about 6 years late. Martha came down at 5:30 and took over the kitchen with the particular authority she brought to all domestic spaces. And Rebecca went to the ledger room and started on the morning accounts, and the ranch came awake around her, the way it always did. Hoofbeats, voices, The sound of the barn doors. Holt's carrying baritone giving instructions across the yard. She heard Caleb's voice once answering something Holt said. She did not look up. Nathaniel Price arrived at 10 o'clock. She had forgotten he was coming. He'd written to say he'd be passing through on his way back from a meeting in Fredericksburg and would stop in if it was convenient. She had written back saying it was convenient, and then the week had become what it had become, and she had entirely failed to hold it in her mind that today was the day he'd said he'd come. He rode in looking well, as he always did. The pressed coat, the clean boots, the self-possessed ease of a man who is comfortable in his own life. He greeted Silas first on the porch, and they shook hands with the warmth of a 4-year business relationship. Then he came inside, and Rebecca met him in the hallway, and he took off his hat and smiled at her with genuine warmth. "You look well," he said. "Thank you. So do you. How was Fredericksburg?" "Productive." He fell into step beside her toward the sitting room. "There's a new commission house opening there in the spring. I've been building a relationship with the principal." He glanced at her. "Could be useful for Bellweather depending on your father's plans for the next drive." They sat. Martha brought tea. Nathaniel talked about the Fredericksburg house, about the spring market outlook, about a water rights dispute in the next county that was going to affect grazing access for 3 or 4 spreads. He was knowledgeable and clear and easy to listen to, and Rebecca answered his questions accurately and asked several of her own that he hadn't expected, and answered with evident respect. He was good. He was still good. Nothing about the week had changed that. They had been sitting for perhaps 40 minutes when he set down his cup and looked at her with the direct, quiet attention of a man who has been watching something carefully and has decided to name what he sees. Rebecca. He used her given name. He'd asked permission for that 2 visits ago, and she'd given it because it was reasonable, and she liked him. "I'd like to ask you something." "All right. When I came in this morning, I passed a man in the yard. Tall, dark vest working the fence line near the gate." He paused. "He watched you cross to the porch before I'd even knocked." He said it without accusation, without drama, just observation stated plainly. That's not how a man watches a woman he's indifferent to. Rebecca held his gaze. "And I don't think," Nathaniel continued quietly, "that I'm the reason you forgot I was coming today." The honesty of it was almost startling. "Nathaniel." Her voice was careful. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," he said. "I'm asking you something different." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his hat held in both hands. "Is there any genuine possibility between you and me? Honest answer." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "I don't think there is." He absorbed that. His face moved through something not devastation, nothing that dramatic. Quiet, dignified disappointment of a good man who had hoped for something and was now setting that hope down without making it anyone else's problem. "Is it him?" He nodded toward the yard. She didn't look toward the window. "It's me," she said. "It's what I know about myself. I'm sorry, Nathaniel." "Don't be." He straightened. He picked up his hat. "I'd rather lose honestly than win because nobody asked you." He stood, and she stood, and he shook her hand. Not the social light touch, but a firm, real handshake, the kind between equals. "You'll do well, Rebecca, whatever you decide." "So will you," she said. And she meant it completely. I went to find Silas, spent 20 minutes with him on the porch, discussing the Fredericksburg Commission House, because Nathaniel Price was a professional and a decent man, and he was not going to let a personal disappointment interfere with a legitimate business relationship. And then he rode out. Rebecca watched him go from the window. Martha appeared at her shoulder. "That was gracefully done." "He made it easy. Good men usually do." Martha paused. "Your father is going to ask about it." "My father can ask." Martha smiled at the side of her face, the small private smile she kept for moments when Rebecca reminded her of her mother. Silas did ask. He came into the ledger room an hour later with the careful tread of a man who has something to say and isn't sure yet how it will be received. Nathaniel left early. He had business in Fredericksburg. He seemed... Silas paused. He seemed like a man who'd gotten a clear answer to something. Rebecca kept writing. He's perceptive. It's one of his best qualities. Silas stood in the doorway for a moment. She could feel him making a decision. The almost sentence, the breath before speaking, the particular stillness of a man who has promised himself he is going to do something differently, and is now testing whether he actually can. He said, "Is there something you want to tell me?" She looked up. "Or something you want to ask me," he added. "Either way." She set down her pen. She looked at her father, at the broad shoulders, and the silvering hair, and the face that had been tired for 11 years, and strong for all of them. The face of a man who had confused protecting with possessing for so long that he didn't know how to stop without also somehow abandoning her. "Father," she said, "I am going to use part of Mother's inheritance. The cattle and the money held separately. I want to establish a small breeding herd in my own name." Silence. "In my own name," she repeated. "Registered under my own brand. Managed as my own enterprise with Bellweather's infrastructure but separate accounting." Silas's first instinct arrived on his face before he could stop it. The automatic parental reflex of a man about to say now. "Wait a moment, or we should think about this carefully," or any of the dozen other phrases that meant "not yet" or "not alone," or "let me decide the timing." He stopped himself. She watched him stop himself. Watched him close his mouth. Watched the reflex pass through him and not come out. He said, "You've thought about this." "For some time. The finances are sound. The inheritance covers the initial herd without touching ranch operating funds. I've run the projections." She opened the ledger to a page she'd prepared 3 days ago and turned it to face him. He looked at the numbers. He took his time. He didn't rush through them the way a man does when he's already decided and is just performing due diligence. He actually read them. "Your spring market timing is aggressive," he said. "It's achievable. You'll need someone who knows breeding stock. I know breeding stock." "You know cattle," he said. "Breeding programs are different. The genetics, the long-term planning." "I'm aware of what I don't know," she said steadily. "I'll learn what I need to learn and ask for advice from people who know more than I do." Silas looked at the projections for another moment. I was still. The particular stillness of a man who is holding two things at once, the instinct to manage, and the new difficult understanding that the instinct itself was the problem. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "All right," he said again. And this time it was not hedged, not provisional, not the agreement of a man who means all right for now, pending my further review. It was the agreement of a man making a choice about who he was going to be from here forward. "I won't ask you to wait on it," he said. "I won't ask you to run it by me first. I'll help when you need help, and I'll stay out of it when you don't." He paused. "That's what I should have been saying to you for years." Rebecca looked at her father for a long moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, looked at the ledger, back at her. "The man," he said. "Not Mercer, not the trail hand. Just the man, as though naming him specifically was a threshold he was approaching carefully. He's good with breeding stock. He knows horses and cattle both." She picked up her pen. "I know. He's been—" Silas paused again. "I've been watching how he works, over the past weeks, properly watching, not looking for faults." He seemed to be finding this speech difficult in the specific way that honest speeches are difficult when you've spent a long time building the case for the opposite position. "He's not what I thought he was." "No," she agreed. "He's—" Another pause. "Better." She looked at him. "Yes." Silas looked at the floor, then back at her. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend," she said carefully, "to make a decision for myself. When I'm ready to make it, without asking your permission." She held his gaze. "But I might tell you about it afterward, if that's all right." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "That's more than fair," he said. He left. She sat with the ledger open in front of her and did not write anything for approximately 4 minutes. She sat with the morning's events arranged in her mind. Rourke at the kitchen table. Nathaniel's handshake, her father's all right, and she understood that the day had given her everything she'd needed to understand about everyone in it, except the one person she still needed to speak to. She closed the ledger. She went to find her riding skirt. Howe was at the north paddock when she came out. She'd asked Eddie, who had a good memory and no filter, and Eddie had told her without understanding what he was contributing to. She rode out slowly, not hurrying, because she had decided what she wanted to say, and there was no longer any urgency in the approaching. The urgency was behind her now. What was in front of her was simply a conversation she was ready to have. He heard the horse and turned. He saw her and went still. She dismounted, looped the reins over the paddock post, walked toward him with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has made up her mind and is no longer nervous about it. He waited. He didn't move toward her, didn't step back, just stood with the same steady presence he carried everywhere and watched her come. She stopped 3 feet from him. "Thomas Rourke told me something this morning," she said. He waited. "He told me Agnes Whitmore sent him, Jessie's mother." She watched his face. Something moved through it, not surprise. He'd already known this, but something deeper. Something that had to do with a woman he'd never met, spending 2 years looking for a way to give him back something he'd given away. She was angry. "I know. She didn't ask you to protect her." "No." His voice was quiet. "She didn't. And you did it anyway." It seemed right at the time. She looked at him. Caleb. She used his given name. She hadn't before. She watched him register it, a slight shift in his eyes, a breath that was marginally slower than the one before it. "Is there anything you've decided is best for me that you haven't told me?" A pause. "Nothing I'm holding back from you," he said. "Not anymore." She nodded. "Good." She held his gaze. "Mr. Rourke is leaving tomorrow. My father has agreed to my breeding herd proposal. Nathaniel Price will not be calling on me again." She said it the way she said most things, clearly, without ornamentation. "I wanted you to know those things." He was very still. "Why?" he asked. "Because they seemed like things that ought to be said out loud, and you're the person I wanted to say them to." She looked at him steadily. "And because I've spent 6 weeks watching how you treat people who have nothing to offer you. And I've reached a conclusion." "What conclusion?" "That if you weren't busy deciding what I should and shouldn't know," she said, "and if my father wasn't busy deciding who I should and shouldn't talk to, you might have asked me something by now." The words sat between them in the cool November air. He looked at her for a long moment. "If I asked you something," he said carefully, "it would be the kind of question a man doesn't ask without being certain of his welcome." "And are you certain?" He held her gaze. "I'm getting there." She almost smiled. She kept it very small. "Then get there, Mr. Mercer." He took one breath, set down the tool in his hand, looked at her the way he'd looked at everything on this property, carefully, thoroughly, with the particular attention of a man who checks twice and trusts what he's verified. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you'd allow it." "That's not a question." "No." The faintest shift in his expression, not quite a smile. Something warmer than that, something that looked like a man who has spent a long time being careful and has, just for the first time in a while, stopped being careful about this one thing. "It isn't." She looked at him for a moment. "Then ask," she said. He held her gaze. "Miss Bell." His voice was low and even and completely certain. "Would you allow me to court you?" She stood in the November afternoon with the paddock post behind her and the North Range stretching out beyond them, and everything she had worked out that morning settled quietly in her chest, like something that had always been there and had only now been given its correct name. "Yes," she said. "I would." He nodded. Slow. Once. The nod of a man who has just been given something he did not take for granted. She picked up her reins. She mounted. She looked down at him from the saddle with the clear, composed expression she brought to everything. Ledgers and supply orders and difficult conversations, and apparently this. "Sunday afternoon," she said. "We can ride the south pasture. I want your opinion on the drainage before winter sets in." The corner of his mouth moved. "Ranch business." "Ranch business," she agreed, and rode back toward the house. He stood at the paddock fence and watched her go. and the thing he felt in his chest was something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Not relief exactly, and not happiness exactly, but the particular quietness of a man who has been waiting without knowing he was waiting and has just stopped. He picked up his tool. He went back to work. But for the first time since Red Fork, his hands were easy. Inside the house, Silas was standing at the study window. He saw Rebecca ride in from the north pasture. He watched her dismount with the particular ease she'd had since childhood, competent, unhurried, completely herself. He watched her hand the horse to Eddie and walk toward the house. He turned away from the window before she reached the door. He sat at his desk. I thought about something Martha had said days ago. Are you protecting her from a bad man, or from making a choice you didn't make for her? He thought about the ledger projections she had laid on his desk. The numbers clean and considered and aggressive in exactly the right places. I thought about a man who had ridden back into dangerous water twice to pull men out, and then written his own name on the wrong side of the truth to protect a widow he'd never met, and then spent 4 years working other men's ranches without complaint or explanation, reading veterinary pamphlets at midnight and taking notes nobody asked for. He thought I told that man to stay away from my daughter. And he had the grace to do it and the character not to hate me for it. He opened the desk drawer. He took out a piece of paper. He wrote a letter, not long, 3 sentences, to Thomas Rourke to be delivered before he left in the morning. The letter said, "Whatever Mercer owes you for the journey, I'll cover it. And thank Agnes Whitmore for me. She sent the right man at the right time." He sealed it. He set it by the door for the morning post. Then he went to find Martha and told her to set an extra place at the table for Rourke's last supper, and to make the pie the good one, the apple and molasses, because some evenings deserved the good pie. Martha looked at him for a moment. "You're going to be all right, Silas," she said. He looked at his boots, then at her. Then he said, "I'm working on it," and went to wash up for supper. And at the long table that evening, with Rourke telling stories about drives he'd worked, and Martha laughing at the right parts, and Rebecca following the supply ledger margins in her head while she ate, Silas looked at his daughter across the table and saw something in her face that he recognized from a long time ago. He recognized it because it was the same thing that had been in her mother's face once a long time before that. Not happiness. Not yet. Something earlier than happiness. The look of a woman who has decided. He looked at his plate. He ate his supper, and he let her have it. Thomas Rourke left before breakfast. How was gone before the house woke his horse, his saddlebag, his oilcloth-wrapped conscience, all of it gone before the first light came over the ridge. He left a note on the kitchen table, 3 lines in rough handwriting that Martha found when she came down to start the coffee. It said he was grateful for the meal and the bed, and that Caleb Mercer was a better man than he deserved to have covered for him. It did not say goodbye, because men like Rourke did not generally say goodbye when leaving was the right thing to do. Martha read the note twice, set it beside the coffee pot where Rebecca would see it. Rebecca came down 20 minutes later, read it, and folded it carefully. She did not throw it away. She set it inside the ledger cover between the front board and the first page where it would stay. She poured her coffee and sat down and thought about Agnes Whitmore, a woman she had never met and likely would never meet, who had spent 2 years tracking down a man she didn't owe anything to give him back something he'd given away on her behalf. She thought about what it cost to do that. Not the travel, not the searching. The other cost. The cost of learning that someone had protected you in a way that required them to carry damage you didn't know you were causing, and then having to decide what to do with that knowledge. She thought that woman had more courage than most people manage in a lifetime. She thought, I want to be that kind of woman. She opened the ledger. The days that followed had a different quality than the 6 weeks before them. Not easier, exactly easier was the wrong word. More honest. The property ran the same way it always had. The cattle moved through the same pastures. The water tank held the south fence, stood the feed tallies came in each morning, and went into the ledger in Rebecca's clear handwriting. But the air had changed. The specific tension of a thing unresolved had lifted, and what replaced it was something quieter and more serious. The particular atmosphere of people who have said what needed to be said, and are now living forward from it. Caleb worked. He always worked. but he no longer worked with the contained invisibility of a man trying to take up less space than he occupied. He asked Holt questions without apologizing for asking. He offered observations in the morning briefings without waiting to be called on. He was still quiet. That was his nature. Not a strategy, but the quiet had a different texture now. It was the quiet of a man who was present, rather than the quiet of a man who was managing his own presence. Rebecca noticed. She noticed everything about him, which she had stopped pretending not to. The Sunday ride came. It was ranch business. She had said so, and it was true, and she did not add anything to it. They rode the south pasture, and she asked him about the drainage channel he'd noted in September, and he showed her what had changed in 2 months and what would need attention before the winter rains. He used numbers. She asked follow-up questions. He answered them without simplifying, and she understood the answers without requiring simplification. And somewhere in the middle of a technical discussion about limestone soil absorption and seasonal creek variation, she realized they were having the most naturally equal conversation she'd had with any man outside her father's study. It felt like breathing without thinking about breathing. "Your breeding herd," he said as they turned back toward the ranch. "What stock are you looking at?" "I haven't decided yet. I want to see what's available at the Fredericksburg market in January. The Carruthers line is worth looking at. They've been working the bloodlines for 15 years. Consistent conformation, good disposition." She glanced at him. "How do you know the Carruthers line?" "I spent a season in Gillespie County 3 years ago." He paused. "Before I came south." She looked at him. "You've moved around a great deal." "Yes." She waited to see if he'd add anything. He rode for a moment in the particular silence of a man deciding how much territory to open. "It's easier to keep moving when you're not sure where you're welcome," he said, "and harder to stop when somewhere finally feels like it might be." She kept her eyes forward. "And does Bexar County feel like it might be?" He was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. "Parts of it," he said. She didn't look at him, but the corner of her mouth moved and she didn't stop it. They rode back without hurrying. The courtship unfolded, the way things unfold when two careful people agree to let them gradually, with attention, without performance. Sunday afternoons became an understood arrangement with Silas and Martha in the background, and the whole property serving as a kind of extended chaperone. There were porch conversations after supper, when the evenings cooled enough to sit outside. There were working discussions through the daylight hours that were ranch business, but were also something else. And everyone on the property knew it, and nobody said anything, because it wasn't anybody else's business to say. Silas watched from a deliberate distance. He had promised himself and Martha, who held him to his promises with cheerful relentlessness, that he was going to stay out of it. That he was going to let it be whatever it was going to be, without commentary or redirection, or the well-intentioned interference that had characterized the first 6 weeks of Caleb Mercer's presence at Bellweather. He was keeping that promise with the effortful, conscious dignity of a man who knows he's fighting a strong instinct, and is fighting it because he's decided the instinct was wrong. It was not easy. It was right. He noticed things that surprised him. He noticed that Caleb listened when Rebecca spoke, not the courteous listening of a man waiting for his turn, but the focused retaining attention of someone for whom what the other person is saying is the most important information in the room. He noticed that Rebecca stood differently when Caleb was near, not softer, not less herself, but more settled, the way a building settles on good ground. He noticed that after their Sunday rides, she came back to the house and went directly to the ledger with a focused energy that lasted for hours, as though being in that man's company sharpened her, rather than distracted her. He noticed all of it. He said nothing. Martha noticed him noticing. "You're doing well," she said one evening. "I'm trying." "That's doing well," she said. "For you." He almost argued with her. He was getting better at not arguing with Martha when she was right. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday in late November, and it arrived the way trouble always arrived at a cattle operation from a direction nobody was watching. Holt came to the house with the look he wore when a number didn't add up. "The Carruthers rider came through," he said to Silas in the study. "The water rights conversation from last month. The one about the seasonal creek access on the east border." Silas looked up. "What about it?" Carruthers is saying we agreed to a different division than I wrote down. Silas frowned. I have Caleb's notes from that meeting. He was present. I know. Holt shifted. That's why Carruthers sent the writer. He says Mercer's notes are wrong. Silas stood. Bring Caleb in. Caleb came to the study with his notebook. He sat across from Silas and opened it to the relevant page. The date the parties present the terms as he'd understood them. Noted in the precise, systematic way, he noted everything with a secondary column. He'd added himself comparing the proposed terms to the previous season's agreement. Silas read it. This is clear, he said. Yes, sir? Carruthers is claiming a different split, 20% better than what you've got here. Caleb looked at the notebook. That's not what was said. You're certain? I'm certain of what I write down. He turned the page. And I have the original terms from 2 years ago, which these new terms were explicitly represented as matching. They don't match by 20%. Silas looked at him for a long moment. If this goes to a formal dispute, you'll need to stand behind that record. I'll stand behind it. Carruthers has been doing business in this county for 22 years. I know. Caleb held his gaze. That doesn't change what was said. Silas sat with that for a moment. He thought about a man who had stood behind a written record 4 years ago, his own written objection, and then been willing to let that record be superseded by a false one to protect someone else. He thought about the difference between that choice and this one. This time, there was no one to protect by being wrong. This time, the record was simply true. All right, Silas said. Bring me the original agreement. Rebecca, who had been in the ledger room next door, had heard every word. She came to the doorway. Both men looked at her. I have the original water rights agreement, she said. I've had it since I filed the last 2 years of contracts. She set the folder on the desk and opened it to the relevant page. The terms Caleb recorded match exactly. Carruthers' claim is off by 22%, not 20%. Silas looked at the documents, at Caleb's notes, at the original agreement. He's been overcharging us, she said quietly. Or trying to. The room was still for a moment. Caleb looked at her. Not with surprise, he'd known what his notes said, but with something that was close to gratitude, which he kept very brief and very contained, because this was not the moment for it. I'll write the response, Silas said. He looked at Rebecca. Will you check the draft before I send it? Yes, she said. He looked at Caleb. Good records. Caleb closed the notebook. Thank you, sir. He left. Rebecca gathered her folder. She was almost at the door when Silas said, Rebecca. She turned. He looked at his desk, at the original agreement, at the 22% discrepancy that his daughter had calculated and named before he had. I'm glad you're running these books, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said, and she went back to work. The Carruthers dispute was resolved within the week. The response letter carrying Silas's signature and Rebecca's numbers and Caleb's dated contemporaneous notes was sufficient to close the matter without legal action. Carruthers's writer came back with a revised position that was essentially a capitulation dressed in polite language, and Silas accepted it without requiring the other man's humiliation. Because he was a practical man, and ongoing business relationships mattered more than winning publicly. He showed the resolution letter to Caleb that evening. Caleb read it, handed it back. Good outcome. Your notes made it possible. Silas paused. He was holding the letter in one hand, and his other hand was in his pocket, and he had the look of a man who has arrived at the conversation. He's been approaching for some time, and is now going to have it, regardless of how it sits. Mercer. Caleb waited. I'd like to offer you a permanent senior position at Bellweather. Silence. Not a trial period. Not a winter arrangement. A permanent post. Senior hand with oversight of the breeding program once it's established, and a seat at the table on cattle decisions. He held Caleb's gaze. Full wage commensurate with the responsibility. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. Silas blinked. No. Not this way. Silas stared at him. I'm offering you a good position based on your work. You're offering me a position, Caleb said, the week after your daughter agreed to let me court her, His voice was quiet and completely direct. "Those two things need to be separate, Mr. Bell. I won't take a wage that could be read as connected to what I'm hoping to build with Rebecca. Not by anyone on this property. Not by you. Not by me." Silas opened his mouth, closed it. He stood there with the letter in his hand and looked at a man who had just refused a generous offer of employment because he didn't want the terms of his work confused with the terms of his courtship, and the refusal itself was so clearly the act of someone with an organized moral compass that Silas felt for the second time in a month the specific discomfort of recognizing that he had misjudged something important. "Then when?" Silas asked. "When there's no way to read one into the other." Caleb held his gaze. "Ask me again in the spring." Silas nodded slowly. "Spring," he said. "And not as compensation," Caleb added. "If you ask me again in spring, ask me because the work warrants it. It warrants it now. I know. Ask me in spring anyway." Silas looked at him for a long moment, and something in his chest shifted the last significant piece of something, a resistance that had been diminishing for weeks and now set itself down entirely. He thought about the first day and the fouled water trough, and the way this man had offered his own departure as the cost of being wrong. He thought about Red Fork and a false statement and a widow in Gillespie County who had never been asked. He thought about a worn notebook with secondary columns nobody requested. "I thought I warned this man away from my daughter, and everything I've learned since has been an argument against myself." "Spring," he said, and extended his hand. Caleb shook it. The weeks that followed settled into the quiet dignity of something becoming what it was always going to be, given enough time and enough honesty. December came in with cold nights and clear days, the kind of weather that made the Texas hill country look like it had been drawn by a careful hand. Limestone ridges, sharp against a blue sky. The live oaks holding their leaves a little longer than they should. The cattle moving through the short grass with the unhurried patience of animals that understood winter. Rebecca's breeding herd proposal went to the county registrar in early December. The paperwork was precise and complete and filed under her full name. The brand she'd chosen was simple. A single clean letter she'd designed herself, registered before she'd told anyone, because she'd wanted it decided before anyone could have an opinion about it. She showed Caleb the registration document the day it came back approved. He looked at it. At her name at the top in the registrar's official typescript. At the brand design in the lower left corner. He looked for longer than a man looks at a document when he's only reading the information. "It's right," he said, and handed it back. She folded it, tucked it into her jacket pocket against her chest. "I know," she said, and rode out to tell her father. Christmas came and went with the particular warmth of a household that had found a new way to be itself. Martha made the food she made at Christmas, the things she'd been making since she was a young woman, and had never stopped making because they were the taste of continuity. And Silas sat at the head of his table and looked at the people around it, and felt for the first time in 11 years that the table was full. Caleb was there. Not as a hand eating with the family as a gesture. As someone who had been asked by both Silas and Rebecca separately, and who had accepted in the particular way he accepted things without too much made of it, without embarrassment or performance. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who has been included in something real. After supper, while Martha and Rebecca cleared the table and talked in the kitchen, Silas sat with Caleb on the porch in the cold December air. They were quiet for a while, in the comfortable way of two men who no longer needed to fill silence with explanation. "She's going to be all right," Silas said eventually. He didn't mean it as a question. "She's been all right," Caleb said. "She was all right before I got here." Silas looked at the dark yard. "I know that." A pause. "I needed someone else to know it, I think. To see it the way I couldn't anymore." Caleb said nothing. "I looked at her and saw what she needed protecting from," Silas said. "You looked at her and saw what she was capable of." He held his cup. "Those aren't the same thing." "No," Caleb agreed. "They aren't." The cold settled around them. Inside, they could hear Martha saying something that made Rebecca laugh, a real laugh, the kind that came from the chest, the kind that didn't care who heard it. Silas listened to it. "Mercer," His voice had gone low, the register he used when something mattered. "I want to ask you something." Caleb looked at him. "When the time comes, and I'm not telling you when that should be. I'm saying when you decide it is. What is it you'll be asking me for?" Caleb held his gaze steadily. "Your blessing," he said. "Not your permission." Silas was quiet. "She'll make the decision," Caleb continued. "That's the only way I'd want it. But you're her father, and what you think of me matters to her even when she'd rather it didn't, because that's what loving someone means. Your blessing matters." He paused. "Not for ownership, for something closer to honor." The porch held the winter silence for a long moment. Silas looked at the man he had warned away from his daughter on a September evening in the barn, when he'd known the old story and nothing more important. He thought about everything that had come after. The water usage numbers with their secondary columns. The Carruthers notes. The refused employment offer. The breeding herd registration she'd tucked against her chest like something precious. He thought about a man in a river riding back into water that had already killed twice, because there were still men in it. He said, "You have it." Caleb nodded once. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Silas looked at the yard. "You'd have had it months ago if I'd been paying attention to the right things." They sat with that. Inside, the laughter had settled into the warm murmur of two women talking at the end of a good meal. The kind of sound that makes a house feel like more than its walls. Silas stood. "Come inside. Martha made pie." Caleb stood. "What kind?" "Apple and molasses." Silas reached for the door. "The good kind." He asked her in January, not with ceremony, not with speeches. He asked her the way he did most things, directly after he'd decided he was certain and before he'd talked himself into waiting any longer. They were checking the water tanks on the east property, the two of them alone in the January cold, and she was pointing out where the freeze had cracked the overflow channel, and he was looking at it and already calculating what it would take to repair it, and she was writing the damage assessment in her own notebook. Her own, not borrowed. She'd started keeping one in October, and he looked at her writing it down and thought, there it is. That's the whole of it. That's what I've been looking at since September. "Rebecca." She looked up from the notebook. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "If you'd have me." She looked at him. Not with surprise. She'd known it was coming, not because he'd telegraphed it, but because she was a woman who paid attention, and she'd been paying attention to him for 4 months. She knew the particular quality of his silences, the ones that meant he was deciding something significant, and she had noticed that quality more frequently in the past 2 weeks. She looked at him for a long moment. "Tell me one thing first," she said. "All right." "The position my father offered you in November. Why did you refuse it?" He held her gaze. "Because I didn't want the terms of my work confused with the terms of my—" He paused. "With this. With asking me." "Yes." She looked at him. "And now that you've asked, will you accept it in spring the way you said, 'If he asks me because the work warrants it'?" "It warrants it." "He knows that." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him with the clear, direct eyes she brought to every decision she'd ever made. Ledgers and breeding programs and supply contracts and everything that mattered. "Yes," she said. "I'll have you." He breathed out. Just once. Slow. The breath of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. She closed her notebook, looked at the cracked overflow channel. "We'll need to repair this before the next freeze." "I know." "Will you write the supply estimate?" "I'll write it tonight." She tucked the notebook into her jacket. "Good." She picked up her reins. "Come for supper. My father will want to know." She rode ahead. He stood at the water tank for a moment. He thought about a September morning and a fouled water trough and a foreman who hadn't wanted to hire him. He thought about a kitchen at midnight and a veterinary pamphlet and a woman who had sat down across from him without being invited. He thought about a barn and a warning and the particular dignity of walking away from something you wanted because you'd been asked to. I thought about Red Fork and Jesse Whitmore and Agnes Whitmore and Thomas Rourke on a gray horse carrying 4 years of guilt in an oilcloth packet. He thought about all the distance between that riverbank and this water tank in Bexar County in January. He thought it was worth it, every mile of it. He mounted his horse and followed her home. Silas was in the study when they came in together. He looked up. He looked at his daughter's face. He looked at Caleb's. He set down his pen. "I see," he said. Rebecca sat across from him. "I wanted you to hear it from me." "I already know." He looked at Caleb. "You asked her today?" "Yes, sir." Silas looked at his daughter for a long moment. He looked at the woman. She was 27 years old and running a ranch ledger since she was 16 and filing her own cattle brand registration and calculating 22% discrepancies in the time it took other people to open the folder. He looked at her the way he should have been looking at her for years, not as something to be arranged and settled and kept safe, but as a person who had been making good decisions without his help for a very long time. "I told you once," he said to Caleb, "to stay away from my daughter." Caleb held his gaze. Silas stood. He crossed the room. He stood in front of Caleb and looked at the man he had misjudged on a September afternoon with the best intentions and the worst information. "I was wrong," he said, "about the story, about you, about what a good father actually does." He held out his hand. "You have my blessing, for whatever it's worth, from a man who took this long to see what was in front of him." Caleb took the hand, held it. "It's worth a great deal," he said. Silas looked at Rebecca. She looked back at him with the particular expression she'd had since childhood, when she was trying not to cry and succeeding on principle. "Your mother would have liked him," he said. She looked at the desk, at the ledger, at her father's face. "I know," she said quietly. "I thought so too." Martha appeared in the doorway, because Martha always appeared in doorways when it mattered, and looked at the three of them, and said with the absolute equanimity of a woman who had seen this coming since October, "I'll put on water for coffee." She disappeared back into the kitchen. The wedding came in April, when the hill country was at its best, warm and green and loud with birds, the limestone ridges softened by new growth, the creek beds running clear for the first time since summer. It was a small ceremony by the standard of the county. The right people came. The right words were said. Martha cried and then denied it. Holt shook Caleb's hand with the firm approval of a man who had learned something about his own judgment. Silas walked his daughter down to the altar of the small church and stood with her until the minister asked, "Who gives this woman?" And then Silas did something no one expected. He paused. He looked at Rebecca, and he said, "She gives herself. I just had the honor of walking with her." There was a silence in the church that had something holy in it. Then Caleb took her hand, and Silas sat down. 1 year later, Rebecca Bell, Rebecca Mercer. Now, though the cattle brand was still filed under Bell, because that was what she'd decided, and no one had argued, pressed the breeding record book closed and set it on the desk. Caleb stood beside her. Not in front of her. Beside. Silas watched from across the room. The record book held 2 seasons of careful data breeding outcomes, bloodline documentation, market results projections for the 3rd season. It was precise and thorough and written entirely in her hand with secondary columns that had been Caleb's idea but were executed in her numbers. Silas had once warned Caleb Mercer to stay away from his daughter because he believed love meant protecting what belonged to you. He had measured Caleb by what he owned and found him wanting. He had been wrong about all of it. Standing in that room watching his daughter close a record book that bore her name and reflected 4 seasons of her own clear-sighted work with a man beside her who had never once tried to stand in front of her. Silas Bell finally understood the only thing that had ever mattered. Rebecca had never belonged to either of them, and the cowboy he had feared most became the man he trusted above all others because Caleb Mercer had